Thank you, Sujan, and thank you, Raj. Uh, First of all, I want to say that I'm here today as a representative of the Subrahmanyam family, not as an external affairs minister, and this is a vote of thanks. So don't hold your breath there. But let me really begin first of all by saying that Sujan, we couldn't have had a better person to deliver the lecture than Raja Mohan, because in many ways I say this to a current director of IDSA about a previous director of IDSA. Raja Mohan was my father's successor in IDSA who never was. Okay. It was no secret among us, certainly in the family, that he was very keen that at some point of time he succeed him in IDSA. It didn't happen. You know, many good things don't happen. But I can say this, that certainly, you know, we belong to the same generation. We studied together. Certainly in the next generation, he was a person my father saw very much as the person with the greatest potential. And I really think over the years, Raj has certainly lived up to it. Having said that, let me also, at the risk of embarrassing you, Sujan, compliment you. But in all honesty, I think I should, because, you know, having seen IDSA built up, and I first, you know, we all first started going there when we were in school. You know, these were the days when you kind of occasionally hang around your father's office, hitch a sort of ride back. It happened much more to us, of course, when we went to college, because it cut the bus time from Delhi University to Netaji Nagar by half. But you know, there was a pleasure in hanging around Sapru House those days, and having seen IDSA come up, I can tell you today, he would be really pleased to see where, you know, you've taken it today, how you are sort of keeping that up, and you know, it's not just in the quality of analysis. I think one of the points on which he used to pride himself was the fact that the government used to take him seriously, and he had a very interesting relationship, and therefore IDSA had an interesting relationship with the government also. Raj has referred to it in a way at the beginning of his remarks, so I think it would only be fair for me to acknowledge it. So let me say something about the subject. I will use the word KS, though it's a bit awkward to talk about your father using initials like that. You know, we have 4 children. We were 3 sons and a daughter. In a way, I was the only son who went into the same business. You know, the others have all done very well, but they were in different lines of businesses. And I went into the business not by joining the government, that came later, but actually by first leaving the IIT to go across the street and join JNU. So I abandoned what may have been a good career in chemistry for what has not been a bad career in international relations. And in a way, what you said was right. I mean, we got free and unconscious education at home. But I can also tell you, you know, it was also something which weighed on you a bit. I mean, you were always, in many ways, compared with him. People expected you to share those views, or sort of live up to his views, his standards, whatever you may call it. So there was a plus and a minus. Of course, the plus outweighed the minus, but it wasn't exactly, you know, as sort of roses all the way. Now, if I were to talk about him as a person, in today's parlance, he would be described as an influencer. You know, he was an influencer because he shaped thinking. He could affect, you know, an audience way beyond those immediately listening to him. And as we grew up, actually, it came as a bit of a surprise to us that, you know, many people knew him. He was quote unquote famous, you know. Some of it was the newspaper, some of it was the television. And I still remember my children, my elder children. Once they were with him in the airport, and they said there was a UN peacekeeping contingent, Blue Berets, exiting, and a bunch of them came up to my father, and I think it was my daughter. We had come out of Sri Lanka, okay, so there was a lot of army in our lives at that point of time. So for her, it was more important. Army recognized him. Said, just imagine, he's famous enough to be known to the army. So he was an influencer in many ways, but he was an influencer because, as Raj has brought out, he was a hard realist who was working in a semi-idealist environment and trying to introduce correctives into the situation, which is what you argue is not what you always do. What you suggest is not always a suggestion for yourself. So, I mean, there are many wrinkles there, complexities there. Now, he was also, obviously, if you're an influencer, those days we'd have used the term, he was a debater. We don't use that term anymore. And the fact was, he was a very visceral debater. Okay. I mean, there was an episode where he had an argument with Henry Kissinger when he came here in 1971. I think Gary Bass's book captures that somewhat. But as Raj and I would recall, we used to see it in JNU, okay, where therefore my endeavor was not to be in the front row because sometimes it could get pretty rough, I mean, I remember once he was being at, this guns and butter issue which you spoke about, Sujan. I had one of my own professors who said that the country was wasting money. It shouldn't be having a navy at all. I mean, we just had questions whether we should be having bases. So those days, people even questioned whether we should be having a navy. And the response which my father gave was, well, there are two sets of people who don't want a navy, the Pakistanis and the smugglers. Now, I don't know on whose behalf you're talking. Now, you can imagine, that's not exactly the time you made eye contact with that particular professor. So there would be, this was in many ways, I would say, the 60s, I'm capturing the 60s and 70s in a way. But like all of us, I hope, he mellowed with time. I think, in a way, I would say there were less mission-oriented, sort of strong advocacy for him. It got broader and broader. But I would say this, I mean, obviously I'm a little biased, but one fact which I saw even at home, even when, I was in my teens, he was a democratic person. That for him, if you had an interesting viewpoint, an interesting argument, it didn't matter how old you were or what you were. I mean, he was always willing to have a good debate democratically with anybody. Now, having said that, what were the personal characteristics which I think helped him to do what he did? Probably the one I would identify most was his constant willingness to challenge dogma. He actually had a book, if my memory serves me right, called Shedding Shibboleths. So this idea that, it will be because it was, and, how can we this, he used to sort of get very angry with what he would call textualism, and particularly much later when, we were in the Indo-US nuclear deal time, and there would be various people whom he knew well, who would kind of say, well, this is a departure from that word, and maybe the deal is not so good because of that. I think it used to understandably sort of annoy him because he would feel that they were losing the woods, not even for the trees, but sometimes for the leaves, and sometimes for the dead leaves. In fact, I remember once in IIC, during that period, he encountered Venkateshwaran, AP Venkateshwaran, who was a very good friend of his, okay? And Sujan, you worked with Venkat, all of us. So, Venkat was Venkat, okay? So Venkat kind of accosted him in the dining room and said, hey, Subbu, what happened to you? You used to be such an anti-American fellow, and here you are advocating, all these deals with the Americans. And of course, my father gave him they were very close, so could give him an equally blunt retort saying, wake up, Venkat, and sort of smell the coffee, the world has changed. So this constant need to update, revise, today what we would call refresh, I think this was something which was important for him. The issues, of course, I think between the two of you, you have referred to a lot of them. I think guns and butter was actually his original issue, and I'm so glad, Sujan, that you brought it out, because his first books were actually, I think his first book was a book called Defense and Development on that particular issue. So, I mean, it got overtaken much later by his nuclear advocacy. The nuclear one, of course, the nuclear cause was something which was dear to him, and he was a very, very strong advocate. Then Bangladesh came along, and I think that was really where sort of, I would say, he hit his peak. Also, because that's when he got much more deeply into the world of politics. He used to work with Chandrasekhar and that group. He became a very close friend of Krishnakant as a result. He worked with the JP. JP was given the responsibility by Mrs. Gandhi to take that campaign international. But when I look at all of that, I'm reminded of something which my younger brothers said when my father passed away, which was he was a person very deeply shaped by his experiences of 62, 65, and 71. And I would add to that 99, but that came much later. I think that wouldn't be shaping so much as by the time he was a well-formed person. I also, again, because Raj touched on it, want to say this, this whole thing, you are what you may call the consistency debate. You are advocating something, but you will not do it at home. No, yeah, okay, it's a fine debating point, but the reality is this is not inconsistency. I think there is a duality in life that all powers, I mean, it's in the nature of international relations that countries have a certain view of, you cannot mix up your offensive principles with your defensive principles. Anybody who suggests that, frankly, doesn't understand the basics of international relations. Now, in all of this, I think if I were to pick a single thread in his professional life, it would be the thoughts and deliberations on the use of force. And again, I'm so glad that Raj picked that as the theme for today's lecture, because the preparation for the use of force, the constraints on the use of force, the opportunity for the use of force, the legitimacy of the use of force. Again, we use the word narrative today, shaping the narrative, creating the narrative. Those days, I think people would have used the word legitimacy. And much later, and I think in a way, I can say this when I was in Sri Lanka, I think he also started reflecting more on the prolonged use of force, because when we went into Sri Lanka, Sundarji was one of his closest friends, and I would come back from Sri Lanka, sort of, not complaining, but vocalizing what I felt was not going right. And then this whole, I think there was a realization that a prolonged use of force abroad has a cost and a sustainability issue. Now, if I were to shift and talk a little bit about the use of force, I mean, clearly the use of force of my father's era was a time when a lot of it was meant for territorial defense. It was about defending and protecting the country. Then, as we saw, I mean, in a sense, Bangladesh was extrapolation of it, but it started shifting to influencing and shaping. You could see that in the, I would say, 70s, 80s, which really meant you were going abroad. So use of force is now no longer completely defensive. There is a near abroad sort of connotation to it. And I think today we have come to a third level. It is the level of common good. That when people say India is a rising power, you're taking on more responsibility. So what are you bringing to the table? I think that ability, the ability to project power, to maintain power, if occasion demands, to apply power for common good. Now, that doesn't, don't take it necessarily in a lethal sense. To me, an HADR operation abroad is an application of power abroad for common good, working with others, even developing maritime domain awareness is the preparation for the application of power for common good abroad. So today, I think when you look at the use of force debate, the old debates are still there. I think this, defending and protecting our country will always be our paramount duty and focus. The influencing and shaping will be increasingly there. But now we have gone to that new level, I would argue, especially, as Raj pointed out, you had Prime Minister articulating the Sagar outlook, the fact that you have an integrated ocean strategy, and there are other ways today by which you are making your presence and capability felt in the world. Now, like everybody else, I think KS2 evolved with the times. In JNU, in political science, which is what I started studying first, there was this big debate about the young Marx and the older Marx. Okay, so if I were to apply that template to him, which was, I think, over a period of time, it was clearly tempered by experience, clearly very much more, in a sense, educated by his understanding and dealing with politics. And a lot of that, I think, also showed in a interest which he developed of power beyond the military damage. So at one level, he got much more interested in understanding and exploiting the contradictions of the world. That was always there because he was always interested in strategy. But in that sense, it brought him closer to my immediate business, as a diplomat. But the one which actually, I would say, surprised, well, I wouldn't say surprised me, but I was quite interested by that evolution, the direction of the evolution, was he got more and more interested in the knowledge economy, in, today, I use today's words, supply chains, knowledge economy, dependency, how do you, leveraging trade, economics. And in fact, I think in his last years, he actually headed a task force for the government. My recollection, I don't remember all the members, but I know Tarun Das was in it. I think Uday Bhaskar was also in it. So he got much more into the non-orthodox power, if you would. And of course, in a way, the Kargil committee report for me was back to governance. That between the Kargil committee and that whole NSAB convenership period, that was him now applying knowledge back in the service of the government. And so it sort of brought him far more deeply into he was always connected to the policy making world, but now very much more so. And this was particularly that period when Brijesh Mishra was the NSA. So let me just, I know it's a long vote of thanks, but let me just conclude with two observations. I think it would interest a lot of people to know that literally the last thing which he was writing, it was on his computer when he passed away, was a piece called Grand Strategy for the first half of the 21st century. I think my son Dhruva has a copy of it. I don't know if he ever got to polish it up and get it out. But certainly, I think when you look at the things we do today, the HADR, even what Raj spoke about, the diaspora as a sort of statement of influence, even initiatives like, Solar Alliance, etc. So the idea, what does India do to prepare itself for the big jump? That occupied his last years very much. That made him grow beyond the more military, narrowly strategic issues. And I would say, as a person, he was always a very patriotic person, but he was also, it came from within. So for him, unlike that famous remark in Godfather, it may have been business, but it was always personal. So with those words, maybe I should hand the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, sir.